you're given, that's how we live it. Don't be mad at the system, it's simply how we've existed. I hear a lot of people talking like they politicians and choose to be an accountant because it's safe in a business. Not because they want to do it, just because they heard it pays. And who the fuck wants to be poor knowing that's how we've been raised? Society is getting heavy, I can feel the weight. The pressure of success is like 100 million pounds of shit.
How you guys doing today? It's Anthony Gangi. Welcome to another episode of TR Talk. Guys, we're going to have a great discussion. We're going to talk about some tips that you need to know when doing your security rounds. Or actually, civilians have rounds, custody have rounds, we all have rounds. So when you're doing your rounds. William Young did a great episode on this. He has a channel called Just Corrections. Now, we did a video on this also about a year ago, so it's time to revisit the topic. If you guys also get a chance, check out William Young's video. It's on Just Corrections. It's a good video, got some good tips, and we're going to go ahead and also give some tips that we feel from our perspective will help you, especially if you're new. I mean, that's the key. I think this is a very 101 dialogue, so I'm very curious to see where it goes. But if you're new and you're, trying to learn from this channel, this right here is a good topic for you to get invested in. Trust and believe, your rounds are extremely important. And who do I have today to talk with me on this beautiful topic? Guys, excuse me, I'm a little out of it. I took the COVID vaccine shot, got a little bit of a fever, but other than that, not that bad, a little bit of a headache, but the show's got to get done. Good information to get out there. So Connie Alleyne, the established author of When the Cage Was Her Cocoon. What's up, Connie?
Hi, everybody. Connie Alleyne here. I am the founder and president of the Civilian Corrections Academy and the podcast host of The Fly Behind the Wall and the author of The Cage Was Her Cocoon. So certainly tonight, I think us talking about just doing your tours and what that looks like and some of the best practices, we hope that it is helpful and that you guys actually utilize the information that we share.
Yeah, it's going to be a great topic, guys. It's definitely something, as I said, that you need to pay attention to. Now, guys, if you haven't, the show TR Talks for you, brave men and women that work in corrections. So please subscribe, interact, engage, comment, hit that bell. Bell's going to notify you every time I post a video. We're going to go to our sponsor and we come back. Let's talk about doing our tours, doing our rounds, doing our walks. Stand by.
I wanted to attend a university that had an intelligence program. I wanted to look at problems different. I wanted to increase my critical thinking abilities. AMU offered those avenues to expand. Obtaining your degree as an adult, you're actually paying yourself and investing in yourself. You can't put a dollar on it, it's priceless. It's something that can never be taken away from you.
American Military University. Learn from the leader.
All right, then we're back. So real quick, obviously we all know custody's got their rounds to do. The civilian departments like social services, mental health, education, medical, the list goes on. They have their rounds to do. So real quick, guys, rounds are extremely vital. And they're vital because that's where the biggest liability is. I will guarantee you, if you do not do your rounds, you will not have a job. Would you agree with that, Connie?
Absolutely. I mean, so I'm sure that on the custody side of the house, like rounds are essential, but as part of standard of care for NCCHC and different accrediting bodies, the expectation is for medical to do their rounds as well. Nursing, I mean, of course, if you're in a specialized unit, if you're in the medical or mental health unit, there's a requirement to do rounds. But even as an administrator, the requirement was there for me to do rounds as well. Nursing supervisors to do rounds. And that's really all eyes looking for different things, and being able to identify other areas of vulnerability because you're doing the rounds, right? So it's not even just, yes, you're checking to make sure inmates are alive and breathing and moving and all that wonderfulness, but we're also checking for other things. Like I remember on one of our inspections, I had gone in to do rounds and realized that there was mold in one of the showers, right? And if you're accredited, your housing unit, your medical unit has to be kept at a certain standard. And all I kept thinking was, first of all, I was surprised that I identified the mold. But then the fact that when the auditor came around, like that was a question, right? And I'm like, wow, suppose I hadn't done the rounds, like we would have definitely had some sort of fine or some sort of finding regarding that. So like rounds are crucial, I think, to all of us, from even just from safety and security, but you will talk about that part.
Yeah, so obviously rounds are going to be done multiple levels. And what I mean by that is, let's just talk about custody, the officer, the supervisors, admin, you know, and every round that's being done, especially as you go to the higher ups, are kind of like fail-safe rounds. You know, officers are doing their rounds, that's great. But if someone has a concern with the officer, we got the supervisors. If someone has a concern with the supervisors, we got the administrative level, whatever it is. I mean, I'm kind of speeding it up the level. But the thing is that the number one concern when you're doing your rounds, it's not always just about the inmates, even though that's a big part of your rounds. It's really also about, obviously, safety and security, because doing your rounds don't mean you're just touring a housing unit. You know, doing your rounds is that you're touring your area, whatever your assigned area may be. I mean, it could be a housing unit. It could be a food service area for custody. It could be the infirmary. You know, so again, there's multiple areas that have to be toured. And again, you're touring for safety and security. That's why it's very important we also have the proper staffing. So the proper staffing gives us the ability to tour. Now, unfortunately, sometimes we could get busy, and sometimes we could wind up getting stuck doing something else, and that could stop us from doing a round. But please, guys, make sure that you put that in the book. Whatever it was that stopped you from doing that round, you make sure you document whatever that is. For some facilities, especially overnight, you're looking at rounds being done every half an hour for custody, for the most part. On the earlier shifts, anywhere from a half an hour to every hour. And again, it's not just in the housing units. It's in the areas that you are directly overseeing. On the medical side, you also have timeframes with the rounds. I mean, not only do you have to be responsible for touring those infirmaries and, you know, hospitals if your facility has one, but you also have the close custody units, which obviously, because they don't, the inmates don't have the ability or as much freedom as GP to, you know, submit a medical request. It is put on medical to definitely tour those units every day to see if an inmate has a need, correct?
For sure. So certainly if someone's on some sort of medical or mental health observation, we do have time frames that we have to meet while we're doing rounds. And I mean, just through the course of nursing care, the nurses are pretty much already doing that. But it's the intentionality behind it and the documentation of it that, you know, you actually did those rounds and you've documented those rounds in the health record. I think the other thing, you know, if someone's on a mental health watch, you know, the nurse has to go in and do rounds there as well. So it's not so much, you know, it's not so much there's just a routine, but there's also a documented expectation that medical and mental health are doing rounds in the units.
And the cool thing is, guys, is if you look to see how many people are actually doing rounds, even though each person may have a different function, when you work in those housing units, look how many people are going to interact with that inmate population. So the inmate's going to have multiple ways to go ahead and address their concerns. But again, you have to do your rounds. You know, we're all reliant on those rounds. And if you're documenting that you're doing it, and that's, you know, and you're not, that's a tremendous liability. And I would also get to the point that's also an unforgivable offense, because you're also put in a position of trust. Now, guys, for me, when I first started, depending on the area, I took note, you know, with a little private notebook that I had, of all the things that I need to take a look at when I'm doing my rounds. So if I was in a housing unit, I remember being trained by a very good officer who pretty much broke down everything I had to do as I toured, in this case, the housing unit, by, you know, checking the cells, checking the inmates, doing the searches, how to do searches correctly, you know, making sure, I mean, we did stuff where we're checking the fences to make sure people aren't pulling little metal things out of the fence to make weapons. So having said that, having a list of what you need to do, you know, as you do your rounds is very important. Doesn't mean you have to follow that list every day in that same exact order, but you should have a checkoff list that, kind of guide you as to what needs to be done. And I would like to think that as soon as you get on the shift, I know for a fact that, at least for custody, if you're relieving another officer, that officer that you're relieving should have done a final round for the day. And then I don't know how it works, because a lot of facilities done away with overlap, which is a very bad thing because you need that interaction. But also when you had overlap, the cool thing about overlap was the officer would wait by the podium while we went ahead and did what needed to be done. So in case there was any concerns, I would still have the officer there to say, hey, listen, I noticed that this wasn't done, or hey, I don't have all my keys here. What happened? Unfortunately, nowadays, without the overlap, as soon as you come in, that officer gives you the keys and they're out the door. And again, not a big fan of that. I wish we would push more for the overlap. But again, the key here, guys, is definitely that communication. But when that officer does their final rounds, then when you come in, as soon as you can, you need to get to your rounds. And be honest with you, that doesn't mean that's not just for if you work a housing unit, by the way. That's any unit. Because once you take over that unit, you are going to be responsible for that unit. So you're going to do your rounds, right? And hopefully you check everything that must be checked. But then you're going to have a supervisor that's going to come in right behind you and probably do rounds that are very similar to what you have to do. And they're going to make sure that what you've done, they're going to make sure to take a look to see what you've done and what you haven't done. And the last thing you want to do is wait so long to do it. And then when the supervisor comes in, they wind up, seeing it and saying, hey, why wasn't this done? And here's a sad thing, guys, I've realized. I'm sure there's some supervisors here that may be able to relate to this. Supervisors, we also know, have mandated tours. But it used to be a big thing. I'm not a big fan of this for officers to count that supervisor's tour as one of their own, which means, okay, well, I know the supervisor is going to come at 2:00, so there's no need for me to tour around 2. No, there is. Because the supervisor has his tour or her tour, and you have yours. Again, it's about more eyes on the field. As long as, everybody's doing their equal amount of tours, that's what needs to be done. But if the supervisor comes in and starts touring, that doesn't mean that all of a sudden you don't tour. Most likely you may tour with the supervisor. But I've seen some people literally, well, the supervisor's coming in, so I'm going to hold back and I'm going to go ahead and let them tour. Therefore, I don't need to tour this half an hour because the supervisor's there. Disagree with that 100%. Connie, have you ever came across that?
Yeah, I mean, here's our thing though, right? So when a supervisor comes in and do the tour, they're touring for something totally different than what's within your role, right? So I know on the mental health side of the house, when nurses are doing their tours, like they're touring because they're checking on, treatments and plans and, medication, like they're doing check-ins, like very specific reasons on their tour, right? When I go into a unit and I'm touring for cleanliness, I'm touring for OSHA violations, I'm touring for possible workers' comp issues. Like my eyes are looking for different things, yes, the safety security side. Like if I see, some paint is chipped, or if I see, tape on a door, or, whatever it is that like you may come across going through those units. Yeah, you bring those things forward, but I'm more so looking from the perspective of where are there some things that could be liabilities that, I didn't notice yesterday, or I didn't notice, the beginning of the week, and now it's Friday and something's going awry or something looks off in the unit. So certainly I feel that, if you are tasked with touring, you need to tour with your own intention, right? Like whatever the expectation of your tour is, that should still be it. Because I think for a supervisor, so I'll step back. When we've gone through the audit process, it wasn't enough that the nurses did their tours, right? And I think that was intentional, right? Because nurses are doing their tours, very defined reason for their tours. Oftentimes, when supervisor goes in to do the tour, it's because there is an expectation that there is a supervisor's presence in that unit X amount of times a week, a month, however your facility does it. And so I feel that to try to count the supervisor's tour as part of any other tour is certainly not the right thing to do, because the tours are expected and they're looked at from different lenses.
Right. I would also like to say, I kind of break it down this way. You have an initial tour, which kind of gives the accountability. And then the rest of the tours throughout the day are maintaining, what you've been doing throughout the day. And the final tour is kind of giving everything over. But again, it's your house. So when you pass that house over, you want to have respect for the officer or for that staff member that's coming in. I love Connie mentioned the cleanliness of the unit. Very important part of doing tours, because one thing is you have a very clean unit. That says a lot about the person running that unit. That means that officer, whoever it is, that staff member has total control of that unit. And if I was to walk into a unit that was in disarray, I'm not taking over the unit. Guys, now that's another thing, guys. That first tour, that accountability tour, I really can't tell people to come in before their shift, because obviously you're not getting paid. But the thing is, guys, is you have to you're taking accountability, which means that I don't think you want to walk into a unit, right when it's time for you to start, without having that interaction with that officer and without doing that initial tour. Again, it's tough because I do respect, well, Gangi, I'm not coming in early because I'm not, not getting paid for it. I get that, but it's tough for me to say that you're ready to work as soon as you get onto your post, because even though they got rid of overlap, and guys, I'm really pushing this back on management to put overlap in. I mean, I can't tell you how important that is. That's important for pretty much any 24-hour, 7-day-a-week shift. Medical as well, the overlap, because there's that communication between shifts. But as of now, because obviously a lot of facilities don't, that communication at the very beginning, guys, is very important, because at the end, if that officer leaves and later on they find out that maybe something wasn't done or there's a key missing or something like that, when you sign into that area, you sign in taking accountability. And that's the truth, guys. When you sign in, you're signing total accountability from one shift to the next, which means that if I come in a minute before my shift starts and I just take the keys over and I sign and say everything's good without really touring around, and that officer goes, look what I just did. I just took full accountability without even looking, without even touring. So again, I'm really pushing for overlap. Please, guys, we need overlap. But if we can't, it's hard because I know you guys want to get paid, but that 10-minute dialogue, that initial tour, before that person kind of takes off, I would highly recommend it. But I do understand, obviously, the other aspect where, Gangi, I'm not getting paid. But just think about the bigger picture, guys. The bigger picture. You're taking accountability. You're allowing that person to leave before you're doing your rounds to make sure everything is okay. What's your thoughts on that, Connie? I know it's tough.
Yeah, I mean, so it's really important to really, so I think the overlap is just critical, just right? Like when you have a team and, everyone's working different shifts, those couple of minutes of overlap just really allow staff to remain connected and accountable to each other, right? Like, because now, that it's that building the relationship, building the team, holding each other accountable, that type of thing. So I support the overlap, right? And I get it. Not every system or facility can actually support having the extra 5-10 minutes because, it adds up over time. I get that. However, I feel like when you come into the unit and the next person's already leaving, you don't quite know what you're walking into. You would like to believe that everything that needed to get done on the shift prior to yours was done, and that if it wasn't done, that your colleague has, documented well what they did, what they didn't do, and why it wasn't done, and sort of where you need to pick up, right? But like, if in fact throughout the course of your shift, you start realizing there's so much stuff that wasn't done. And now you're struggling or fumbling to try to get it all done and still do your tours and still do your documentation and everything else that comes along with being on that shift. You have taken ownership for everything that wasn't done. Because now, if you don't do, has now not gotten done on 2 shifts. And so now whatever is still the excess is going to end up going over on 3rd shift, which is usually a skeleton shift. And will they be able to make up for what wasn't completed all day, right? So like, I feel ultimately there is this snowball effect that will happen as we're not getting stuff done and we're not able to just, touch base with each other just to see where we are. Because I think the other side of that is when you don't know up front that there's extra stuff you need to do, you lose the ability to advocate for help, right? Like, hey, so how do you go to your, so just to think, someone works 7 to 3, then the 3 to 11 shift comes in, or 4 to 12, whichever way you guys do it. But the supervisors, say on the civilian side of the house, the supervisors are going between 5 and 7, right? Maybe you'll have a supervisor on the 2 shifts. And I know with custody, you guys have supervision available 24/7, right? But that's not always the case on the civilian side of the house. And so when things like that happen, now you don't have a supervisor to kind of intervene, right? Like there's someone who could have made the judgment call to say, oh, all these things weren't completed on 1st. Let me see if I got someone who can stay for an extra 2 hours. Let me see if I can shift and move people to try to make sure you get the support, because it's important that all the stuff gets done. So I just think that as we think about there not being an overlap, and knowing that when you step on to, any unit, you own whatever's left. Like, it's important that we start really making sure that we document one, but also we just do a quick touch base, even if it's just 2 minutes. Hey, I didn't get to do X, Y, or Z today. Because at least I know that now here's the X, Y, and Z in addition to what goes on I got to take care of.
Right. And during that initial tour of accountability, the reason why I say, if possible, the faster you can do that, the better. And what I mean by that is the faster you can start it, not the faster you can complete it. The faster you can start it, the better, is because if there is a concern, then you can kind of call the supervisor, document it, and we're only within maybe 20 or 30 minutes, which, maybe, but if you're not finding out you're missing a key for an hour and a half into the shift, that's going to be very hard for you to sell that you haven't lost that key, that it was from the shift before. Because me as a supervisor, the first thing I'm going to say, it's been an hour and a half. You better give me a good reason why you haven't been able to check these things in the first hour and a half of your shift. So again, the tour of accountability, again, just that initial tour, very important. If there are any discretions, or any concerns, if there's stuff that, wasn't done, call the supervisor immediately and document. It's sad because it's not like I want you to go against your peers. That's not the case. But if something was to happen, you are going to be held totally responsible. And believe it or not, guys, I would like to say that some of these things could be a dialogue between both parties, and there's really no need to call the supervisor. But sometimes, guys, it may be. Sometimes you could take over a unit and find out that maybe 1 or 2 cell doors are not properly secured. Now, the officer who did the final round before they, left and you relieved them should have checked on those things. Now, granted, the door's faulty. I get that. But let's just say in this world, the door is not faulty. And when you do a round, all of a sudden the inmate's able to open up the door and get to you. So for me, sometimes the reason why you may want to tell your supervisor is because that person should have did their tour correctly, which means that do whatever you can to make sure that those cell doors are secured if you work in that type of unit. But you get the scenario. The point is the officer giving you, or the staff member that's given over their area of control to now you, has that responsibility of that final tour. That means when they give it over to you, they're telling you everything is okay. That's a trust that we have. but that doesn't mean that I'm still not going to go ahead and do my rounds. But in the meantime, that when we're not having that dialogue, it makes it very tough to know what concerns, have to be addressed. But Connie, again, just that final round. I mean, you're expecting the person when they do their final round before they give over the unit to you, you expect them to have crossed every T and dotted every I, correct?
Absolutely. I mean, so I think we understand how challenging and how stressful and how things just pop off, right? And so I would expect, I guess, if you have a certain work ethic and you have an expectation of yourself and you're going to hold yourself accountable, you kind of still hold your colleagues to that same standard, right? Which is, I wouldn't want to leave my colleague out there trying to figure something out in the middle of the night, or, they stumble upon something that I knew was an issue when I started my shift at 7:30. And here it is, it's end of shift already. It's next shift now. And here I'm leaving my partner in the lurch, essentially. Because even if it's an issue, right? I feel like the least we owe from a professional perspective, right? Even if you don't give two craps about that person, the least we owe is to give a heads up. Hey, listen, I was doing my tour. I found that this thing was out of place or something was going on with the door or the lock or whatever. I made a call, right? Because at least there was something you did. You may not have been able to complete the task. Maybe, whoever didn't respond, whatever happened along the way. But I think at least the heads up, because that also gives me the confidence that you knew what was going on during the shift. And I can then trust that you would have most likely dotted all your I's and crossed all your T's. And now I can feel comfortable going about, my shift, however I was going to plan on doing that.
Remember, guys, the logbook is really only specific information. I mean, part of the exchange between you and that officer that you're relieving is also the temperature of the unit itself. What's going on with the population, any concerns with any particular inmates or whatnot. I mean, I've had some officers write down a lot of stuff and then they would pass it off to you in the hopes that you have time to read it. Sometimes it's not that easy, especially working in a very active facility. But again, if, one person's not staying and one person's not willing to come in early, then maybe that's a route we could take. I mean, again, just out of desperation, we could take some notes throughout the day that couldn't be put in the logbook, just more of, direct observations or some discretionary notes that you feel will help the person that's coming in after you. But also on another concern, guys, this is the most important part of your job. So let's not minimize it by, just thinking, okay, Gange, I do these tours every day. Guys, this is really not just a tour of accountability, but also a tour of trust. I'm trusting that you're doing what's expected of you. So when I come on to take over, I'm trusting you that you've done whatever you can for me to protect me. And the sad thing is, guys, and we all know this, guys, in corrections, I know a lot of jobs, when you look at that clock and you have that last hour, everybody tends to tone it down. You can't do that in corrections. I mean, you have to run all 8 hours or all 16 hours, whatever it is, as if it's your first. Because again, you don't want to tone it down and then someone comes in and you became a little bit complacent. And now that officer who just relieved you, you find out the next day the person was doing their first initial tour and they got assaulted because the cell door wasn't properly locked. And again, that's something that we check. And even if let's say the lock doesn't work, note it, document it, do whatever you can to request that inmate to be moved. And if, because I know what happens in some states, unfortunately, with those locks, they have these older systems. Make sure that your partner knows as you're leaving you. Hey, guys, listen, I'm having trouble with that lock all day. I've requested for the supervisor to get that inmate out of here. Maybe, you could push on your supervisor. Just keep that communication going and let that officer or let that staff member know who's coming into your area about what's happening with some of the security equipment that you have. Real quick, I got one more thing. We could probably do a lot more tips in the future, but I also want to cover one more thing. the interaction with the population is probably going to be, you know, in any of your tours. I mean, we're always going to have that interaction. So I do have some advice when you're, you know, walking your units or touring your areas and you have those interactions. So, well, first, let's go with Connie first. Obviously, Connie, very big part of tours is the interactions we have with the inmate population. So what are some of the tips that you would provide, or on the adverse of that, what are some of the no, don't do that?
Oh, so tip the affirmative side, I would say, so if you observe that someone was particularly agitated, someone had a disturbing phone call. I mean, I feel like we know this, but you know, there's certain things that I think throughout a shift that you just observe along the way. You notice, you know, two inmates had like an exchange of words, but like for some reason it was kind of squashed on day shift. Like usually it's not just squashed, right? Which I think we've learned that. And so I would, you know, just have to say that is noteworthy, right? Like you mentioned the discretionary notes. Maybe it's not necessary to put in the logbook, but have something that you could kind of pass off, because it will give whoever your relief is, you know, the heads up that there was something kind of brewing a little bit, which I think is something that's critical. I've seen on the medical mental health side of the house, you know, where they've noted someone felt particularly, or someone was agitated, or someone refused their meds, right? And we might think like, oh, inmates refuse meds all the time. But so prescribed medication means you're supposed to take it at a particular time a day, right? And so there are side effects to those medications. And so usually if they're prescribed at a certain time of day, it's because like for people who have trouble sleeping, or if it's a mental health issue, but that particular med makes you feel a little drowsy, like that may be something that's prescribed at night versus during the day. And so that person won't be as agitated at night, right? And which means you're going to be able to get your work done because the population is stable. So if in fact someone didn't take meds that, you know, it could create a situation on the next shift, like it's certainly not okay for you to ignore that or to not document it. I mean, you might document, like every place does meds differently. The people are still using a Cardex, or they use an electronic health record. Like it is noteworthy. And if there's a particularly challenging inmate on the unit, like I think it's important that you bring that forward so that the next shift knows that this person didn't take their meds, so their state of instability or agitation may be much higher on that shift, because those things do destabilize a unit. And so I guess I would just say, as we are thinking about what's important and what's not important to share in the log versus discretionary notes, or just simply a heads up to whoever's coming on, like I think those are things that are kind of the must do's, you know, regardless of whether or not you're going to stay on the extra 2 or 3 minutes, or you're going to wait around to kind of get the report out.
Yeah, the key is, guys, is that we're encouraging the value of the importance of that dialogue. Now, here's the sad thing. We know it's very important. We know it's needed. And then when the state did away, or whatever the agencies did away with the overlap, then we decided, well, I guess we're not going to do it because we're not getting paid. So what do we also just say? That's not that important. Because now that we're not getting paid for it, it's not that important. We should have kept ourselves in that momentum. So if they ever decide to revisit it, it's easier to challenge and say, hey, we still got officers doing overlap right now because it's that important. Because once you start functioning without it, then those agencies start believing that it's not needed. One thing I would like to say on tours is keep your focus. Don't get distracted. We talked about having a little bit of a checklist, especially if you're new to the area. You may not know everything that has to be done. And there usually are a lot of things that are done on tours. Third shift have very big areas to tour because they're prepped. They're prepping the facility for the next day. But guys, keep your focus where it needs to be. Again, we're talking about inmate interactions. Don't engage longer than you need to. If the inmate has a concern, quick and to the point. Or let's redress this after I've done my rounds. You know, they've had all the time in the world to address it, but then they wait for you to do your rounds to, hey, I got a concern. Well, it could be distracting. So if it's not an immediate concern or it's not an emergent concern, I'll come back to you. Let me just go ahead and do what I got to do because I'm still in the middle of a count. And guys, real quick, the tour itself is something that you don't do just to get out of the way. You give it 100% each time you do it. I know sometimes we get so conditioned that we have to do a tour that sometimes when we get stuck and overwhelmed with work, we wind up putting the logbook that we toured anyway when we did it. Don't do that. You can justify why you weren't able to make the tour. Or, hey, I'm stuck with this work. Let me call my supervisor and say, hey, listen, can you help me out? I'm stuck doing this paperwork. I'm not going to be able to do my next round until I get this paperwork done. But don't get into the habit of, you know, even though I'm stuck with work, I'm still saying that I'm doing my rounds because you're going to be held accountable if something happens. But Connie, would you agree with that, Connie, that you're not doing the rounds to get them out of the way. You're doing the rounds because you have a job to do.
Yeah. So first of all, I'm glad you mentioned the logbook and just not documenting in there if you didn't actually do the log. So one thing I think people forget is that the logbook is a legally binding document, right? And so the fact that it's a legally binding document means that in the event there is something that happens, they are going for that logbook. They are going to use that logbook as almost evidence, right? They will build whatever case for or against you based on what you've documented in this legally binding document. I think the other thing that I wanted to make note of was that certainly falsifying anything in there calls into question your integrity, but it also calls into question everything else that you've done, right? Because if we can't trust you to honestly document in a logbook, how much other stuff have you done that wasn't within policy and procedure? How much other stuff have you falsified? And so you just don't want to go down that rabbit hole as it refers to the logbook. And I think the other thing, you know, just to highlight about the tours is that you gather so much intelligence when you're doing the tours, right? Whether it's you being able to observe what people are doing in their cells, how they interact with each other. You know, there's just like all these little pieces of information that I think as you're touring, it may seem initially insignificant until it's not, right? It's like, oh, you remember the other day when I did the tour and I saw them over here doing this thing. It didn't mean anything at the time, right? But now here's an incident where that little piece of intelligence now matters. So that's something that I think is important. And the last thing I wanted to just throw out there about the tours is that, so with doing the tours, I feel like the tours are also like a deterrent, right? So here it is, we have a presence in an area, and that presence can deter the offenders from doing whatever underhanded, undermining stuff that they were planning on doing, just because you have a presence there. And so if we don't have a presence, it's kind of like open season, right? So, you know, if anything at all, like you are that first line of defense to really deter them from behaviors that we don't want to see happening in the facility.
Right. And guys, I also want to mention something too, especially for supervisors out there. You're our line of communication also to the inmate population. So if there's a concern, let's say with an officer on the floor, and we may say, well, bring that to your area supervisor. And then we find out through the population that area supervisor isn't touring. We just eliminated a giant resource. Now we're going to go back and check to see, because again, you have tours as well. You know, are you doing what you got to do? Because again, there you alleviate those conflicts. If I'm an inmate, I have a problem with an officer on the floor for whatever reason, I got the supervisor I can go to now. And that also gives us a little bit of a way out. You have an inmate that kind of says, yeah, I have problems with this officer. As admin, we could always say, okay, did you bring that concern up to the area supervisor? You know, I mean, try to see if it can be handled at that level instead of having the inmate be able to jump all three levels. And again, we're not talking about emergent issues, just maybe personality conflicts or something that we feel could be better handled by what's on the floor. Now, the problem is if you're not doing your rounds, the inmates are going to start jumping up that chain, and then we're not going to have enough faith when we put that thing down. We'll go see your area supervisor. We're not going to have faith in that. So now we're going to start answering those things, and we're going to start making it a little bit more serious than it has to be, because we're going to show that we have zero tolerance, because we trust that we are doing our rounds. So if an inmate has a concern, we have those levels to alleviate those conflicts. I also want to say, again, part of our interactions with the inmate population, note your body language as well. You know, guys, you're dealing with inmates. Don't get to the point where you're too comfortable that you kind of forget where you're at or where your surroundings are, guys. I mean, the last thing you want to do is get caught up in this very unprofessional dialogue. And the whole time, while you and the inmate are chatting and whatever it is. I know Will said hands in your pocket, just, in each other's space. The whole unit's running amok. Why do you think that inmate is trying to chat with you right now? Why do you think that inmate, made that connection with you on sports? Because he knows that when you come down the unit, you're going to talk about 5 or 10 minutes about sports. But guess who else knows it? The other inmates. So now, when you're caught up in that dialogue for 5 to 10 minutes, they could do whatever they want to do in those cells or in those areas, which include assaults, rapes, using contraband, making weapons that could later be used for you, or on you, or on your partner, all because you're getting caught up in a 10-minute dialogue about sports. Keep it moving. You have a point? No, keep it going. That's it. I'm not here to have that dialogue. I'm here to get from point A to point B. Sure, there could be a little discussion along the way, but that discussion should not stop you from moving forward. I want you guys to think about that right now. I know a lot of people may say that you can engage in small dialogue to get a temperature, and I get that. And that's how we get a feel of who we're working with. But make sure that dialogue does not stop you from moving forward, because at one point, that small dialogue could be a distraction. What's your thoughts on that, Connie?
Well, I mean, I've seen it, right? Like I've seen it where, you've had multiple inmates trying to ask a nurse a question, right? Meanwhile, they're trying to get swipe meds or swipe, whatever, right? Supplies, whatever their intention is, we've seen walking, doing your tours, and then there's the distraction, right? And the distraction for whatever reason there is. And, I think that's just a very good point to highlight, that as you're kind of forward moving, you've got an agenda, here's what you hit the floor to do, just hit the floor, get that done, and then go back, right? Because now you've had your full attention to your tour. And if there was a question along the way, it's okay to set that professional boundary, right? There's no emergency. The inmate can wait, right? Oh, hey, nurse so-and-so, I got to ask you something. Or even to the officer, let me ask you a quick question. It's give me a second. When I'm done here, I'll come back to you. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that.
I agree. Especially, guys, if you're having that small dialogue every day at the same time, you're predictable now. And the inmates are going to know at this time, you're going to engage with inmate such and such about whatever it is that you guys have a similar interest in. And next thing you know, you've lost total control of your area. Connie, you have anything you'd like to say in closing?
I would just like to say, tours are really important. At the end of the day, there's so much that we learn when we're touring, as an administrator, touring with the warden, I got to see things from a different lens because he looked at things differently, even, the way he engaged with the inmates, the way he engaged with the officers, it was just really, so much to be learned on the tour. And I get it. If it's your unit, you tour it all the time, you know, every lock, every this, every that, but things change. So, you know, I would just caution, you know, anyone from becoming complacent, right? Becoming that person who's so in the routine that they don't notice when things are out of place. And that's what tours are supposed to do.
I agree. Guys, again, it's just keeping your mind where it needs to be, making sure the job gets done. But ultimately, guys, the tours are that level of accountability that if I'm relieving you, I trust that you're doing it. And the more we reinforce that, you know, the safer it's going to be. You know, that's key. And again, any concerns, document. As always, guys, your show is Tear Talk. If you haven't, please subscribe, interact, engage, comment, hit that bell. Bell's going to notify you every time I post a video. Stay safe.